On July 26, 1996, the Sierra County Sheriff's Office in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, receives a call from the husband of 22-year-old Kelly Garrett, who tells them he hasn't seen or heard from his wife in more than 24 hours. He and Kelly had an argument the day before. She stormed out and has been missing ever since. A deputy tells him there is little they can do. Kelly is an adult and has not been gone long enough to be considered a missing person. He is also reminded that in a highly transient area like Truth or Consequences, it's not unusual for people to come and go on a regular basis.
There's two towns. The city of Truth or Consequences, which is a very small town. Directly adjacent to it is the village of Elephant Butte. And Elephant Butte exists primarily because of the man-made reservoir there. But this little town kind of sprang up around it, just like any town will spring up around a large body of water in the middle of the desert. Maybe 1,500 people live here year-round. It's a real popular tourist attraction on holidays, upwards of 100,000 to 150,000 people that come to this lake.
It's gorgeous. It's truly God's country. You can see for 50 miles in all directions. The sunsets are killer sunsets. There's lots of space. There are older people who have retired and are looking for good weather, looking for sunshine, and a nice place to settle down. But this area has attracted a lot of folks with probably shady past. Maybe some of them want to start over and redeem themselves. Maybe other people want a new place to hang out and continue to do drugs and violence.
The day after her husband reports her missing, an employee of nearby Elephant Butte State Park brings Kelly Garrett home. The last thing she remembers is waking up in a truck on her way home.
I was so dazed and incoherent. I don't remember getting out of the truck. I remember sitting on my in-laws' front porch. My hair was a mess. I had sand everywhere. I was still in the same clothes I was in the day I left. And he was telling my in-laws and my husband about how he found me wandering around the beach. He took me to his house and gave me bread and water. Then he took me home.
Kelly tries to recall the events of the past 2 days since her husband last saw her.
We had gotten in a fight. I left and went to a friend's house. There was a bunch of friends that we all just decided we were going to all go play pool. So we went to a bunch of different bars, and we ended up out at Blue Water Saloon. Up until we got to Blue Waters, I had not been drinking at all. And when we got to Blue Waters, I had one beer. I left to take a friend of mine home and came back, drank some more of that beer.
By the end of the night, most of Kelly's friends have gone home, except for Jessie Ray.
I had known Jessie for 3 or 4 years at least. We used to go play pool all the time, and I trusted her.
Suddenly, Kelly starts to feel dizzy and asks Jessie for a lift home.
Jessie decided she was too drunk to take me back home. I remember telling her to take me to a friend of mine's house. And she said she could do that. I don't remember walking out the door. I don't remember the ride. I think I remember getting off at Jamie's house and walking around, but I couldn't find her house. So, I don't remember. I did not know what had happened. I was bleeding, and I didn't know what to do. I thought that being sexually assaulted had been a possibility. I just knew I was hurt.
Kelly's husband doesn't believe her story and kicks her out of the house.
He was very angry because I couldn't remember, so there's no way I could talk him out of it.
With nowhere to go, Kelly asks the park employee to drop her off at a friend's house until her memory comes back and she can figure out what to do next.
If I would have known how to get a hold of Jessie, I would have tried to, since she was the last one I remember seeing. But I didn't know how to get a hold of her, so I couldn't, and I never seen her after that.
Desperate for answers, Kelly considers going to the police.
I didn't know what to tell them. They weren't going to believe me that I didn't know what had happened. So what was I going to tell them?
Her husband never forgives her. Humiliated by the failure of her marriage and unsure of what happened, Kelly moves out of state.
When I moved to Colorado, I tried to forget about it. But I kept having nightmares about a knife being held to my throat, or duct tape, or being tied to a table, or something. And nothing ever fit together. So I didn't know what they were all about.
Almost a year after Kelly Garrett vanishes and reappears, on July 7, 1997, the Sierra County Sheriff's Office gets a visit from the mother of 22-year-old Marie Parker. She tells officers she hasn't heard from her daughter in days.
Marie Parker didn't live here for very long. She spent a lot of time on the streets. At one point, she borrowed a tent and took her daughters down to Elephant Butte Lake, and she was living out of a pup tent on the lake.
Police put out an APB for Marie's car and check out some of her known haunts. They learn Marie was seen at a bar in the company of an ex-boyfriend, Roy Yancey, and a friend of theirs named Jessie Ray.
Marie Parker was at the Blue Waters Saloon out on the edge of town on July 5th.
When questioned by police, Jessie Ray tells them that Marie was drunk, so she gave her a ride home. That was the last she saw of Marie.
Marie was never seen again.
With no indication of foul play, police suspect Marie left town. From July 1996 to July 1997, two young women vanished shortly after being spotted in local saloons in Elephant Butte, New Mexico. The first, Kelly Garrett, is found days later with no memory of what happened.
I was scared, but I didn't know what I was scared of, or who to be scared of. But I kept having nightmares, so life was very hard. Carried a gun for a long time.
Police suspect the other woman, Marie Parker, left town.
Marie Parker was offered her a ride home, and she took it and was never seen again.
Both women were last seen in the company of locals Dennis Roy Yancey and Jessie Ray. Both also frequented the Blue Waters Saloon.
The Blue Waters Saloon was just a typical saloon. People who maybe had a long, boring day in town would get together with their friends and down a few beers and shoot some pool and have a good time.
And like many bars, some merely come to escape sadness in their lives. Jessie Ray is a regular at the Blue Waters.
She has a powerful personality. She was a biker. She had relationships with women. She's very social and outgoing.
Jessie Ray works as an auto mechanic and splits her time between Albuquerque and Elephant Butte, where her father lives and works in Elephant Butte State Park.
Jessie was a real leader among people, both men and women. She has some loyal friends. She has some other people that are really frightened of her.
Dennis Roy Yancey also frequents the bar. He grew up in Truth or Consequences.
Dennis Roy Yancey grew up getting in a lot of trouble. They actually canceled Halloween one year in TRC because of Yancey and his friends. They were strangling cats and flipping over gravestones, and they actually laid down rules so none of the little kids could go out and trick or treat that year. He was in the Navy. He got thrown out of the Navy, dishonorable discharge. He seemed to attract trouble, and he liked being known as a troublemaker.
Shortly after Marie Parker's disappearance, 37-year-old Cindy Hendy joins the Blue Waters scene.
She was on the run from the authorities. She and a friend of hers tried to deal cocaine, but they dealt it to an undercover agent. So she ran away from Washington State. Cindy Hendy's background up in Monroe, Washington was horrific at best. She was molested by her stepfather when she was 11 years old and told her mother, and her mother chose to believe her husband rather than her daughter and kicked Cindy out of the house. She grew up to be violent, and she didn't appear to feel bad about anything. She was 105 pounds of pure muscle, and several of her old friends and ex-boyfriends told me that she could beat up a 250-pound woman in a bar. She also beat up a few men during her time.
It's not long before Hendy falls in with Jessie Ray and Roy Yancey and starts making waves in town.
Cindy Hendy had a couple of different boyfriends down here, and she'd always get in violent fights with her boyfriends, and she got thrown into jail for a few days, and she was on a work release program out by Elephant Butte Lake.
There she meets Jessie Ray's father, 57-year-old David Parker Ray.
David worked as a mechanic out there at Elephant Butte State Park, dressed in a little ranger outfit. And they just accidentally ran into each other one day, and I guess they hit it off right away.
David was a charming guy to be around. He was basically a middle-class man. He had education, and he had respect from the people around him, but he kept his distance.
What Cindy Hendy doesn't know is that David Ray is a master manipulator with a very dark secret.
David Parker Ray was an enigma. He'd do favors for people he liked. He'd do little things for them that made him a friendly person who was easy to approach. But I think in the back of his mind, he was always thinking about sadistic acts.
David Parker Ray was a sexual sadist. A very unique and very rare type of offender. A sexual sadist is aroused by a living victim who is physically or mentally being tortured.
If you were a woman that was alone with him, David was Satan himself.
David Parker Ray's sadistic desires could be traced back to his childhood, when he was shuttled around between family members who severely neglected him.
When people talk about child abuse, they usually talk about abuse, not neglect. But the therapist will tell you that neglect has far more sinister consequences on your adult behavior. And David didn't feel like any of the women in his life loved him. He didn't think his mother did. His grandma didn't pay any attention to him. She didn't care whether he was alive or dead.
The young David Ray would write for hours in his journal and had a vivid fantasy life.
His fantasies began about 12, 13, or 14 years of age.
His dad was a drunk and a drifter and would come by once every month or two, and he would leave a bag of magazines for David to look at. They were photographs of real girls bound and gagged by the hands and the mouth on the front cover. And if you opened up inside, you would see women half-dressed who were being tortured.
Pornography was something that he was extremely interested in, and it fueled him, and it continued to fuel him.
Those two things shaped David very much, neglect and pornography.
Ray joined the Army after high school and was married several times before he settled with his last wife in Elephant Butte in 1984. Prior to working for the park, David Ray worked as an aircraft engine repairman, among other mechanical vocations. His wife left him 10 years later in 1994.
He was married 4 times before he met Hendy.
The only constant throughout David Parker Ray's life has been his devotion to his sadistic perversions.
David Ray liked to see himself as a victim of a terrible curse that was growing completely out of control.
There's a point in David Parker Ray's life where he crossed the line. A sexual sadist whose fantasies will more than likely involve the victim's response to that infliction of physical or emotional pain may feel that, hey, this isn't enough. I want to try with non-consenting partners. I want to really make this real.
With the help of his daughter Jessie and Roy Yancey, David Ray has been kidnapping and torturing women for years.
David's life revolved around this sadomasochistic sexual torture, and I think that he surrounded himself with people that he felt would be of benefit to himself somehow. He could control them, he could manipulate them, and they could get him what he needed or help him get what he needed.
David Ray was God, basically, to his daughter Jessie, to his buddy Yancey. To get your followers to do things like that indicates how much power you have over them.
And a bar like the Blue Waters Saloon is the perfect place to find vulnerable people on which to carry out his fantasies.
David understood that people he oftentimes surrounded himself with used drugs and alcohol, and that was a good thing for David because he could at least feel more comfortable that they may not remember a lot of things about what happened the night before.
In January of 1999, Cindy Hendy moves in with David Parker Ray.
I think Cindy Hendy helped to normalize the appearance of David Parker Ray. If he had a woman in his life, people would not look at him immediately as some scary guy who could be involved in something so criminal.
The two are drawn to each other because of their similar sexual appetites.
Sexual sadists, because of the violence of their behavior, the extreme of their behavior, it would be very hard for them to find quote-unquote a soulmate. But I think that Cindy was enamored with him.
Cindy Hendy was into kinky sex most of her life. So when she came to New Mexico and met David, it was kinky sex on a whole different level. I think she was into it.
Cindy was aware of David's sexual interests, and the connection between the two is probably very complicated and very involved. And I would also suggest that Cindy Hendy underestimated David Parker Ray.
Hendy was loud and funny, and David was shy and quiet. And they say that opposites attract, so maybe that had something to do with it.
1 month after moving in with David Ray, invites her friend Angie Montano over for a visit.
Angie Montano moved here with her son to get him out of Albuquerque. She was trying to start her life over again, like a lot of people who move here.
In February of 1999, Angie Montano unwittingly walks into a world of trouble in Elephant Butte, New Mexico. After luring her into their trap, sexual sadist David Parker Ray and his girlfriend, Cindy Hendy, blindfold her and restrain her to a bed. Over the course of the next 4 days, Angie Montano is shuttled back and forth between a number of different rooms where she is repeatedly sexually assaulted and tortured.
David Ray was way beyond being a psychopath. He was an individual terrorist.
A sexual sadist can be one of the most violent criminals because their sexual interests can result in so much damage to the victim. They will go to whatever extent it takes for them to become sexually aroused. Whatever it takes, whatever they want, anything goes. It does not matter. It does not make any difference.
Angie is victimized with cattle prods and electric shocks, as well as a number of homemade and customized sexual devices.
Montano was tortured very badly on several different levels. David didn't do things like that quickly. He really made people suffer.
Sexual sadists who are acting out, their victims are insignificant to them. I use this analogy. If you got up in the morning and you used a tissue to dot your makeup or shave, and you threw that tissue away, and then you go to work, do you worry about that tissue? Are you concerned about that tissue laying in that garbage can? Are you concerned about what the ultimate fate of that facial tissue is? No. And for some of these individuals, that's how they view their victims.
David was a mechanic. He treated human beings as victims like you would treat a piece of machinery.
Cindy Hendy assists David Ray in the abuse.
According to David, he introduced Cindy Hendy to his torture techniques on a real gentle level because he didn't want to scare her off. And she was apparently challenged by what he did.
Sexual sadists can be extremely adept at identifying a woman that they can bring into their criminal behavior.
Cindy Hendy, one of her friends down here, saw hand imprints on her butt where David had spanked her. He spotted a true companion, a true sadistic companion.
Angie's ordeal at the hands of David Parker Ray and Cindy Hendy comes to an end on February 21st, 1999.
She pulled David over and said, "David, I need to get back to my son. You don't need to do these bad things to me." And David said to her, "If I'd known you were this nice, I wouldn't have kidnapped you in the first place," which probably wasn't true. But he did decide to let her go. And they took her up to I-25 and released her after 5 days.
While she was on I-25, she was picked up by an off-duty deputy sheriff. She explained to him what had occurred. He wanted to stop at the state police office in Socorro and report the matter. She didn't want to because of things in her past. She was afraid of the police. He believed what she was saying. However, he became suspicious when she refused to report it to law enforcement.
The off-duty officer drops Angie off close to where she lives. Less than 48 hours after being released by David Parker Ray, Angie Montano leaves Truth or Consequences for good.
Angie went back to Albuquerque. She got out of this town as quick as she could.
Two weeks later, Cindy Handy tells David Ray she would like to visit family in Washington State.
Hendy's daughter was about ready to give birth to Hendy's first grandchild up in Monroe, and Hendy wanted to go home for the birth of her grandchild.
Ray allows it, but under one condition.
David said, let's go get a sex slave to satisfy me in the meantime. Cindy Vigil was working as a prostitute in March of 1999 in Albuquerque. David was up there with Hendy, and they tricked her into getting into their little motor home. And then they handcuffed her at gunpoint and drove her south.
Cindy Vigil is taken to their home, and a collar and chain are attached to her neck. She is bound to a bed, blindfolded, and gagged. Now, in total darkness, she hears the click of a tape recorder and the sound of a man's voice.
Hello, bitch. Well, this tape's getting played again. Must mean I picked up another hooker. And I'll bet you wonder what the hell's going on here.
For 5 long minutes, she listens as the recording goes on to explain how David Parker Ray and his lady friend are going to rape and torture her in every possible way.
The gag is necessary because after a while you're going to be doing a lot of screaming.
David played this tape for his captives for the purpose of terrorizing them and to tell them what was going to be done to them.
He instills that fear into them right off the bat.
He would play those tapes just to see the reaction. I want the reaction to what I say, what I do. I want to see it in your face. I want to see it in your body. I want to see it in your tears.
For the next 3 days, Cindy Vigil is raped and tortured in the home of David Parker Ray and Cindy Handy. On March 22nd, 1999, Ray goes to work, leaving his girlfriend to watch over their captive. After 3 days of being raped and tortured by David Parker Ray and Cindy Handy, on March 22nd, 1999, 22-year-old Cindy Vigil is at her wit's end.
She had a dog collar around her neck. She saw the keys. She was by herself. Her guard was David's girlfriend. She was out making tuna sandwiches, I think, in the kitchen. Vigil saw those keys.
The Sierra County Sheriff's Dispatch Center receives a 911 call from 513 Bass Road.
Handy heard the commotion in the living room. Vigil stabbed Handy in the back of the neck, just enough to stun her, and ran out the door and down the street, wearing nothing but a dog collar and a 5-foot chain. She ran about a mile, and she spotted a double-wide trailer and barged through the door.
Another call comes into 911, this one from a different address. When local officers arrive, they are shocked not only by Cindy Vigil's appearance, but also by what she tells them.
They had responded to a 911 call where a young woman had appeared naked and hysterical, claiming that she had been abducted against her will.
Cindy V. Hill tells the police how, for days, she was taken back and forth between rooms in her captor's home and assaulted and tortured in a number of ways. V. Hill is taken to the hospital for examination as officers call for reinforcements.
When they responded and began to get initial information from her, it became clear that it was probably something that they were not going to be able to handle with their resources. They contacted the state police.
Knowing now that the 911 hang-up came from David Ray's home, law enforcement converge on the source of the call. 513 Bass Road.
The Sheriff's Department and the Park Rangers arrived at the scene here. They do what's called a safety sweep inside the residence. They're looking to find if there are additional victims inside, if there's anybody that's in need of assistance. Inside the house, it was a mess. There were pegboards these devices were hanging on, D-rings in the ceiling, and ropes and pulleys, and a box where people would be kept shackled with a fan on it for an air source. We were obviously dealing with somebody that was not normal.
He had books on Satanism. He had medical books also, really complex medical books that gave him the knowledge he needed to do the things that he wanted to do.
It was bizarre.
Finding no one inside, an APB is put out for the home's residents, 59-year-old David Parker Ray and 39-year-old Cindy Hendy. Less than 15 minutes later, police pull over David Parker Ray's truck and detain the couple.
David was on his way down the road with Hendy, and they were looking for their captive, and they got caught 2 blocks away.
When the police question Ray and Hendy, the two admit to looking for Cindy V. Hill, but provide an interesting explanation.
Initially, David and Cindy Hendy's story to us regarding the abduction of Cindy V. Hill was that it was a form of humanitarian aid. They claimed that they had abducted her against her will, but it was for her own good, to help her kick a heroin addiction. So they brought her here, chained her up inside the house, and kept her there with a bucket in order to get her through the most drastic withdrawal period of heroin.
Authorities don't believe them, and David Parker Ray and Cindy Hendy are arrested and taken into custody. On March 23, 1999, the New Mexico State Police crime team begins processing Ray's house. The police realize they don't have the resources to deal with what they've found on their own. They call in the FBI.
I think it's safe to say that nothing that was inside that house was anything any of us had experienced before or come across before, except maybe on a movie somewhere. It was just completely out of the realm of our experience.
Investigators open a padlocked semi-truck trailer next to the home.
Once we gained access to that, its purpose was very clear. It was a very sinister little travel trailer.
For the first time, investigators get a look inside what David Parker Ray calls the toy box.
When they went into the toy box, they found hundreds of torture devices. They found leg spreaders, soldering irons, chains, rubber ropes.
There were intubation tubes, an oxygen tank, just the most bizarre devices I had ever seen.
He was a mechanic, and so a lot of these things he designed himself. He had a machine that would shock women's breasts electrically. He would hook up this machine to their breasts and then turn on the power and then increase the power as they screamed for mercy.
This is someone who spent a lot of time, money, and effort putting this together. It did not just happen overnight.
The biggest piece, of course, was the gynecological chair, a big black chair with red straps all over it, where he would tie women down. He had a fancy camera with screens, so he would force the women to watch what he was doing to them.
Everything designed to work, everything designed to be readily available, everything designed to torture. It was chilling.
So if you went to his property, it was just a little piece of property on the edge of Elephant Butte Lake, And then right in front of his house was the torture trailer. It's hard to believe that nobody ever heard somebody yelling or screaming. He carried out this form of mass torture right in the middle of a retirement community.
It was so well organized and there was so much of it, it was clear that this wasn't something that had just been going on for a couple of weeks.
It was his little world that he put together after all these years of practice.
Sexual sadism develops over a long period of time. It's not something that you wake up with at 60 years of age and begin to experience. It is evolutionary.
Working together, the police and federal investigators catalog everything they find on David Parker Ray's property.
At any given time during this investigation, there were between 25 and 35 FBI or state police evidence techs here.
Along with the FBI, local and national press soon descend on 513 Bass Road. After seeing a story on the news about the arrest, Angie Montano comes forward and provides a detailed statement of her days in captivity.
She described essentially the same type of sexual assault, sexual torture, and binding that had been described by Cindy V. Hill.
She was in the toy box. She was in there for 3 days. She got it the worst you can get it.
On March 30th, 1999, an FBI agent discovers a videotape inside the toy box. The tape shows David Ray with a woman strapped into the chair. Her face is completely bound with duct tape. The unidentifiable woman has an intricate tattoo on her leg.
We watched the videotape that had been discovered by the evidence techs from the toy box. The person that was in the tape was not readily identifiable. We knew that she had an ornate and unique tattoo on her leg and felt that that might be sufficient to identify her, or at least help to identify her. So we gave that information to the media.
The public outreach works when the FBI receives a call from someone who believes she knows the tattooed victim. The caller is Kelly Garrett's former mother-in-law.
She heard it on the news about David Parker Ray and how he had kidnapped Cindy V. Hill. She just put two and two together and realized that he was the one that took me home that day. That's the reason I had been gone for 3 days, was because of David.
Investigators traveled to Colorado to interview the possible victim.
Then they came up and interviewed me and was asking me all kinds of questions about tattoos and my feet and where I was and if I could remember a certain part of my life. After I showed them the tattoos that I have, they showed me pictures of my tattoos that they had taken off of a video, and I had to identify myself from those pictures. After I seen the pictures that they showed me, everything started to click. So I knew all of my nightmares that I had been having, they weren't just nightmares, they were true.
Kelly finally recalls the night at the Blue Waters, where she believes Jesse drugged her drink before delivering her to David Parker Ray.
And then I started remembering other things. I remember being at Jesse's dad's house. One of them held a knife to my throat, while the other one put handcuffs on me. Then I remember being tied to a table. They had duct tape on my eyes and mouth. I could see under the duct tape where it had come loose from my cheeks. I could see David walking around. I could see all kinds of sex toys hanging on the walls, posters, whips, and chains. There were several times I lost all hope. And I just kept telling him I want to go home. I want to go home to my husband. I just want to go home.
Sexual sadists who act out on non-consenting partners, they don't have a conscience. They are not restrained in their behavior because of their lack of emotions and feelings.
Based on the interview with Kelly, David Ray's daughter, Jessie, is arrested for the kidnap and assault of Kelly Garrett.
Jessie Ray is the one who took Kelly Garrett over to her father David's house. She pled guilty to kidnapping, Jesse was given 9 years in. She subsequently violated that probation and was sentenced to prison.
As the investigation continues, the state builds its case.
My reaction was the same as that of the FBI agents and state police officers investigating the case, and that was, I can't believe this is real. As we delved further into the case, we found out just how real it was.
They get help from an unexpected source.
Cindy Hendy became cooperative within a few days of her arrest. She wanted to talk, she wanted to give information.
Cindy Hendy tells investigators that although she has only been assisting David Parker Ray in the abductions and assaults for months, he told her he's been torturing and killing for years.
I believe there are bodies here. It remains to be seen whether they're in the lake itself or whether they're in the desert somewhere. But I personally find it impossible to believe that somebody that had developed this behavior to such an extent, he would not be killing people. This is such a vast, rural, and remote area, and this body of water is so large and difficult to search. It's just too convenient a disposal site for bodies for them not to be there.
Despite extensive searches throughout the lake and the surrounding desert, however, no bodies are ever found.
David worked as a quasi-park ranger, and he knew that area inside out. And there were caves and mines and all sorts of places out there where he could have easily hidden whatever he didn't want to be found and would never be found.
Cindy Hendy also says that besides herself and Jesse, David Parker Ray also had help from Roy Yancey. Police pay a visit to Roy Yancey, who surprises them with an unexpected confession.
Marie Parker was a missing person in Truth or Consequences. She had been reported missing several years before.
Marie Parker had dated Yancey for a little while previously. On the night Marie disappeared, Jesse told her that she'd take her home.
It was not until we interviewed Roy Yancey that we finally understood what had happened.
Roy Yancey indicated that he and Jesse were involved in taking Marie Parker to David's house.
Marie had been abducted, much like Kelly had been, against her will, and that ultimately David, in another measure of control, Roy Yancey had been instructed to kill Marie Parker.
And help David dispose of her body.
But when Yancey took the authorities out to find her body, David had moved it, so they've never found Marie's body.
Roy Yancey pleads guilty to second-degree murder and is sentenced to 20 years in prison. He is up for parole in 2010. Charged with 25 felony counts for her part in the crimes against Angie Montano and Cindy V. Hill, and facing up to 197 years in jail, Cindy Hendy cuts a deal, and on April 6, 1999, pleads guilty to the kidnapping and sexual assault of Cindy V. Hill.
Cindy Hendy was given a 54-year sentence. She was sentenced to serve 36 years of that. She'll serve the remaining time on probation upon her release. David cooperated to an extent in the investigation. He would talk to investigators and he would describe various sexual acts and various sexual encounters with women, but all in the context of a fantasy world, never admitting that these things actually happened.
I get my excitement from making a woman happy. I got pleasure out of the woman getting pleasure. I did what they wanted me to do.
David Parker Ray faces 3 trials, one each for the crimes against Cindy V. Hill, Angie Montano, and Kelly Garrett.
I was scared. I was very scared to testify because I didn't know who was going to believe me.
In Kelly's trial, David Parker Ray is found guilty on 12 counts of kidnapping, criminal penetration, and conspiracy. His sentencing is put off until all of the trials are complete. The state then begins its case on behalf of Cindy V. Hill.
During Cindy V. Hill's preliminary hearing, I placed an item of evidence in front of her, which was the collar and chain. When that was placed in front of her, she looked at it, stood up in her chair, pointed at David and screamed. She then continued screaming and was escorted from the courtroom to a separate area. Paramedics were called to make sure that she was going to be able to continue.
Before the closing arguments, David's attorneys approached the DA.
As we were getting ready to rest, David said, "That's enough."
In exchange for all charges against his daughter Jessie being dropped and her release from jail, David Ray agrees to plead guilty for his crimes against Cindy V. Hill.
The only matters that were not brought against David were the cases involving Angelica Montano. That is because Angelica died prior to these matters going to trial.
On September 30th, 2001, David Parker Ray receives the maximum sentence: 224 years in prison for his crimes against Kelly Garrett and Cindy V. Hill. On May 28, 2002, he is transferred to the Lee County Correctional Facility in Hobbs, New Mexico, to serve his sentence. While his paperwork is processed, David Ray is taken to a holding cell, and he slumps over, dead of a massive heart attack. He dies without having officially served 1 day of his sentence. David Parker Ray may be dead, but for many, he is far from gone.
This case is a case that gives you nightmares. You try to separate these matters from your personal life. It can't be done.
These women were objects to him. He did not care about these women. What he cared about was fulfilling his sexual fantasy. They were nothing to him. Nothing.
I'm scared. I just can't do anything anymore. I can't take my kids to the park. I can't go to a grocery store. I can't do anything by myself. It's just a very hard life.
5 children shot every day.